fast we used to translate, you know.
Oh, really? I'll try and speak slowly.
Dobra, to zaczynamy w takim razie. Dzień dobry Państwu, witam na pierwszym zebraniu w tym roku Komisji Archeologicznej Oddziału Poznańskiego Polskiej Akademii Nauk, które odbywamy w trybie hybrydowym. Jesteśmy w tej chwili w siedzibie Oddziału Poznańskiego Pan Pałacu Działeńskich na Starym Rynku i wykład jest transmitowany w czasie rzeczywistym online. Naszym pierwszym gościem w tym roku jest profesor Craig z Uniwersytetu w Yorku, który jest uznanym specjalistą w zakresie bioarcheologii biomolekularnej. Zajmuje się badaniem wielu materiałów archeologicznych, szczególnie ceramiki, z punktu widzenia różnych form działalności człowieka w różnych częściach świata, głównie w północnej Europie, w Afryce, w Ameryce Północnej. I na dzisiejszym wykładzie będzie prezentował część trwającego projektu dotyczącego rozprzestrzenienia się i wykorzystania wczesnej ceramiki północno-wschodniej. To welcome you in Poznań. This is the lecture organized by Archaeological Mission, College Academy of Sciences in Poznań branch. And it is organized. So there's a number of people listening to us now, and introduce you as a sort of well-known scholar, professor of archaeology at the Department of Archaeology in New York, and you'll be talking about your ongoing project in innovation, dispersal, and use of ceramics.
Thank you. Dzień dobry. Welcome everybody online. What are you?
Okay, can you say something?
Yes. How's that? Testing. Any good?
Yeah.
Works? It's working? Shall I continue? Okay, I'll continue. Sorry. Communities, particularly not true. In the Far East, the Russian Far East, or in Japan, or in China. Oh, okay. No, stop.
Single words on so starting from the beginning would be a bad idea.
Restart.
Just restart. Sorry. But it's just news, from somebody who's listening to you online.
It's okay.
Shall I
So my name is just inform everybody.
Okej, wykład się nauczył.
Dobra.
Okej.
Ja ci powiem.
Right, start again.
Okej. Będę muszę technicznej.
Take two.
Rozpoczynamy ten wykład jeszcze raz od samego początku. Teraz straciliśmy 5 minut, ale myślę, że warto mieć już całość dobrej jakości. Zapraszamy bardzo. Ja będę na start again.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Me start. Okay. Right. Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, to Jacek, for the kind invitation to speak here, and the Polish Academy of Sciences. So I'm going to talk about this ERC project. It's been running for 5 or 6 years. It's entitled The Innovation, Dispersal and Use of Ceramics in Northeastern Europe. And the first thing I want to say is that if we're in this part of the world, then we need to be thinking about hunter-gatherers, because so if we go back and think a bit broadly about hunter-gatherer pottery use, it's quite an interesting topic, because for many years people have insisted that hunter-gatherers were not able to really use pottery. They had no need for it. You often get depictions like this taken from North America of hunter-gatherers roaming the landscape, being very mobile and having very little use for and heavy. So it was always seen as something that was very unusual and had to be explained. This is a quote from Graham Clark back in the 1930s. And when he was studying the Etibolo hunter-gatherer communities of the Western Baltic, he always thought, and a lot of people thought at the time, that there was no way that these communities could find evidence for pottery using hunter-gatherers. It was always thought that. Of course, we know now that that's not true. There's evidence from particularly East Asia, where we find ceramics dating back all the way to the late Pleistocene, well before the arrival of farming into that area. If we go to Africa, similarly, we have ceramics in the Nile Valley before the arrival of agriculture. In the North America, we have the vignette culture, this woodlands culture, who had ceramics well before the arrival of maize into that area. And if we look into the Baltic, there's also plenty of examples of ceramics predating farming. And this volume that was published a few years ago by Peter Jordan and Marek Svelibil, where they really put that case forward and brought it to the attention of the West. Of course, people in the East, China, colleagues in ceramics predated farming, but it's the Western scholars who have really now started to really accept this. And I think before we talk about the particular project, it was very important at the start, hunter-gatherer pottery. So there is very little evidence that pottery-producing hunter-gatherers were on a trajectory towards farming. This notion that pottery then led somehow to agriculture, I think has to be dispelled. Many communities around the world adopt pottery. In many cases, there's very little evidence that pottery-producing hunter-gatherers had any contact with farmers whatsoever. And the concept that we wanted to promote in this project is that pottery-producing hunter-gatherers are dispersal, population growth, and social interactions. So we felt, particularly in Europe, that the communities had very little attention paid to them in the past. And the thought that hunter-gatherers were somehow living on the margins of Europe in quite marginal environments is also completely untrue. Obviously, they were central. They're living in often rich aquatic ecotones, so very rich resources, and not marginal environments. And this is the problem of taking ethnographic examples of modern-day hunter-gatherers and trying to impose those on past hunter-gatherers, where, of course, the context, the environmental context, is completely different. Another paper that came out in 2016, again from Peter Jordan and the group, was to actually look at radiocarbon dates for all hunter-gatherer pots across Eurasia and try and make a model to look at how they dispersed. Now, this is difficult, as I'll explain later, from dating pottery is inherently difficult. But the map that they produced and the model that they produced is quite interesting because, as you can see, the oldest dates, 14,000, this is calibrated years BC, to the Far East, and it fits with a model of dispersal from the east to the west across Eurasia during the Holocene period, arriving somewhere into the Baltic region at around around 6,000, 5,500 BC. Similarly, there's another idea that pottery perhaps originated in the Levant or in Africa and then spread into Europe at around the same kind of time. Now, what's interesting about this is that this red line denotes these two worlds. One, which is completely hunter-gatherer, which is the dispersal of ceramics from the east to the west, and the other, which eventually led to the introduction of farming. Neolithic that most Western scholars recognize today as a. But what I would say about this work was it's very interesting, but the sparsity of dates, if you look, this is where all the dated pottery lies. And you can see that there's a big cluster, obviously, in Europe, in Western Europe. But when we go back and look into the Siberia and Northern Eurasia, there's so few dates made on pots. And so while this map is very interesting, we felt that we in a lot more detail. A few of us, I think this was probably in the early 2000s, formed the early pottery research group. And we had some very basic questions, which was, why did hunter-gatherers invent pottery? Just why? To what degree did pottery transform prehistoric economies and society? So was it a big transformation to their economy when pottery arrived? How and when did pottery disperse globally, and what factors stimulated or hindered its dispersal? So the dynamics of dispersal. And then the last question, which I think is really interesting and what we're currently concerned with, is how pottery is changed, particularly with the arrival of farming. When the hunter-gatherers eventually are replaced or adopt farming, how does the use of the pottery change? So for the Induce project, we can go back and think in 2016, we had some broad ideas. Henny Pazonka, who was then working in Grisfeld, produced a very nice book as part of her PhD doctoral thesis, where she tried to focus in this area of northeastern Europe and produced a very nice gazzetta of radiocarbon dated pottery. And at the time, she was able to identify some broad style groups. And in terms of dating, she had the idea, which follows on from the Jordan paper, that pottery seems to be earliest in the eastern part of this region and later in the western part of this region. And perhaps starting in the 8th millennium in the east and ending in the 6th millennium BC in the west and going into the 5th millennium. So that was a very formative document that we had to work with at the start of the project. We also were working very closely with Vladimir Levosky. He was excavating some fantastic sites at the time in Russia, the site of Zamoshchi 2, for example, where they had a brilliant array of organic preservation. So one question we had was, are we able to analyze the ceramics in more detail to look at their use? Are we able to date them more specifically to actually shed light on this question of dispersal use of ceramics by hunter-gatherers in this part of the world? So this was funded by the ERC. Carl Heron from the British Museum was the PI. I had a team in York. We started in 2016, and it was meant to be a 5-year project, but obviously one thing led to another. We had the COVID pandemic, and not least now, we're also facing continued problems with the current crisis in Ukraine. So the project is due to finish next year, so this will be a very long project by the end. This is the team very quickly. We had a range of specialists, ceramic analysis and contextualization by Katia Dolbanova, who was working for the British Museum, who was now based in the Hermitage Museum in Donker as well, was helping with the analysis of the ceramics themselves, the traditional analysis, the characterization of the technology, the forms, the decoration. We had a massive team working on pottery use and organic residue analysis. This was not all of these people were employed at the same time, but people were doing lab work to actually analyze the contents of the pots to work out their use. We also had someone working on the archaeobotany to look at the plant remains embedded in the food crust. And then we had a team who were headed up by John Meadows, who were looking at the dating of the pots and how we can do the spatio-temporal modelling. So John Meadows is based in ZBSA at the University of Kiel. Half the project team in the British Museum, and I would say and the other half were based at the University of York. So if we think about why did hunter-gatherers invent and adopt pottery, we can come up with several plausible scenarios. I think one of those, which was really at the front of our mind, was this must have been something to do with a change in the environment. Perhaps we're seeing in the Holocene these new optimal conditions for boreal expansion of boreal forests, new resources becoming available, and that allowed the pottery was innovated as an adaptation or adopted as an adaptation to those new environmental conditions. Other people have suggested no, it's not environment, it's more about a technological driver. Maybe it's just that before ceramics, people used all sorts of different containers. They had a similar use, and ceramics are just the hard versions of those. It was a relatively minor step where people started to use ceramic instead of perhaps basketry or other forms of more perishable containers. And it's just the fact that ceramics survive, which is why we're so interested in them when we study them. In fact, it's just a small step in the evolution of that step that's visible in the record. Other people have said, no, it's perhaps more about cultural aesthetic drivers. Pottery was associated with prestige, feasting, and allowing for the first time for foods to be combined, to be cooked, combined to create new flavors and tastes, and very much putting that kind of phenomenological approach into action. So our question was, well, we can find this out. If we analyze pots, we can actually look at their contents and try and decide which of these hypotheses is most real, most true. And then we can also look at the degree to which pottery transformed subsistence strategies. We can compare the use of pots with the other paleoenvironmental records that we have from the sites to kind of see whether there's a change or whether it coincides with the broader subsistence. And one thing I would say about analysing pottery to look at their use is that really we're looking at pottery function, but we're really, if you think about cooking, we're looking at culinary choices. So, and this brings us into a kind of theoretical approach behind interpreting the residues on pots we find is that it really is about cuisine, and cuisine is socially situated, and it does not necessarily reflect subsistence practice. People choose what to put into a pot. They don't just put anything that's available to them in a pot. So this is a cultural attribute rather than an economic indicator, perhaps. And if so, then maybe it's inherited in similar ways to how they made artifacts or how they buried their dead, which are deeply cultural. So we can have this idea that we know the kind of foods that are available to a community. So we have cheese here, this model, fish, pigs, and ruminant animals, cows. But if we find in the pots that we don't see, we see all these animals on the site, but we only see a selection in the pots, then we can try and understand what cultural choices people have made. That's kind of the idea. So how do we reconstruct pottery use using residue analysis? And what we do is we look at the lipids that are present in the pots. Now the lipids are fats, oils, and waxes. They're a class of molecules that preserve pretty well in the archaeological record. And because these fats, oils, and waxes are not present in every product, we are a little bit limited to the kind of range of products we can identify. So animal fats, we can identify quite readily because they're quite fat-rich, if you know what I mean. So, and from that, we can distinguish between ruminant animals, which could include domesticated sheep, goats, cows, but also wild ruminants such as deer, and non-ruminant animals, which would a wild boar, pigs in this context. We can distinguish dairy products, and there's a lot of work that's carried out on that. Beeswax is it's obviously a wax, so that survives quite well. Also tree resins. We can distinguish the oils from aquatic animals quite clearly. And to some degree, and this is a bit more tricky, we can identify plants from their waxes and oils as well. We always ask, can we identify wine and beer in pottery? Could we actually find evidence of fermentation? This is tricky. We have some markers for fruits, and we can be a little bit specific about assigning those to grape products. But actually studying fermentation and identifying fermented products is difficult because the process of degradation, and trying to distinguish these things is quite difficult. So how this works is these products are cooked into a pot, absorbed into the actual wall of the ceramic, or they form on the surface. So sometimes we see food crusts, we call them, charred deposits on the surface of the pot, but quite often the lipids, the fats, oils, and waxes absorb into the actual ceramic surface, into the porous structure of the ceramic, and then they get preserved there for thousands of years. And we've managed to get lipids from pottery dating all the way back to the late Pleistocene in Japan, going all the way back to 14,000, 15,000 years ago. So very, very good preservation. As long as we have pottery, the conditions are dependent depending on where we are in the world, but as long as we have pottery, we have a good chance of actually understanding their use using this approach. And then we use chemical methods to extract the lipids and determine their origin. And this really works because these are unglazed ceramics, or a bit like molecular sinks. The molecular traps, they just suck in molecules. We use a method called gas chromatography mass spectrometry to separate out these, after we've extracted from the pot, to separate out these molecules and identify them. We also use isotopic approaches to actually give us more information on the source of the fats present. New research now is able to look at deuterium isotopes, so we can maybe even understand the seasonality and the climate that those foods were produced under that then entered the pot. We're working on that. And perhaps the most exciting thing more recently has been the ability to actually date some of the molecules that are in the pot. The dating pottery is inherently difficult, but if you can pull out the food molecules and date those individually, then that would obviously give you a huge leap forward in terms of pottery dating. Just to show you, this is a little bit of an idea of how it's done. And I show this slide just so you can see the kind of destructiveness of the technique that we're doing. Just the and we were sampling actually drilling parts of the pots. And you can see it's a little bit destructive. It's usually on the inside of the vessels, and we take about a couple of grams at most. The other things we're very interested in are these carbonized deposits, which we can scrape off and analyze. Sometimes, not in this part of the world, but in other parts of the world, we have these very thin calcite deposits on the inside of pots, and we can work with those as well. And those seem to be very good proteins surviving as well as lipids. So that gives you kind of an idea. How does it work in more detail? Well, we use chemical biomarkers, so specific molecules. Don't worry about this molecule here, but when we find it, we can actually specifically attribute it to fish. So we can use a particular chemical and can say that this must have come from this aquatic organism. So that's quite useful. Other molecules can distinguish cereals. We're working on that at the moment, or things like beeswax. And there's a whole array of these different compounds that we can relate back to the product. More generally, we use continuous samples. So we measure isotopic composition of different molecules, or sometimes the bulk of the substance, and we can try and distinguish that way as well. A little bit like how people use stable isotopes when they're looking at familiar with that. Even more detail, this is a particular chromatogram, and you can see we're separating out these different molecules here. It's quite rich, it's full of different types of compound, and this can give us some information. But then if we analyze the isotope values of these compounds here, we can then plot against reference ranges from modern animals and get a much better idea of where this residue is derived from. So we measure these molecules and we plot them against these reference ranges. And one of the big to measure the modern animals, it's quite for this kind of work has been quite difficult, especially with modern agricultural practices. Deer that haven't been eating maize from local fields would alter the isotopic composition, trying to get a fish. Now we've got maybe 700 or 800 reference samples, or looking at hunter-gatherer. So, right, I'll go straight now to some archaeological studies. And this is some work that we did in the Eastern Baltic, the Narva culture. Appear in this part of the world at about 5,500 years ago. This is an idea of the pots. We also have these oval bowls that people have interpreted as lamps as well. Lots of these food crusts on the inside of these vessels. And this was work carried out with a great colleague, Esther Oras, who's at the University of Tartu. So we working on this for a long time as a little sub-project. And when we did this analysis, and these little dots here reflect individual pots from different sites, you can see that the coastal pots, which are red, contain marine oils. They plot in the marine area. The inland ones plot in the freshwater fish area. Nearly all of them had these aquatic biomarkers. So analysed, cooking pots and the lamps all contained aquatic foods. Very little evidence of anything else in the vessels. Now this was interesting because we know that the economy, a lot of deer, we see a lot of wild boar, we see quite a diverse gatherer subsistence economy, but the pottery use was very focused on aquatic resources. So we came up with this idea, singular cause for ceramics in this area, which is associated with aquatic foods. We have this idea that we have this other pottery producing people coming from the north into the Baltic who are really focused their pottery production on the exploitation of aquatic food. So we see that pottery is introduced after the broadening climate optimum. We think it's coming from hunter-gatherer exchange networks from the east or southeast, and it has a very limited range of use of adapted this idea, which is the aquatic Neolithic, which is people aren't having to move around as much to pursue other types of game and foods in the environment. That in turn suggest social aggrandizing and population growth. The work we did in North America, well, this model fits very well. However, applicable, we can see clear critique. In the eastern part of the Baltic, were there from the start of the Holocene, well before pottery. So it's difficult to say that pottery started these intensive fisheries. Other parts of Mosian water. These transitional layers, we see that there's very little difference in the exploitation of fish. The actual formal assemblage doesn't change to the layers, even though pottery is introduced in what they're calling the early Neolithic layer. And I just have to say here that the term Neolithic, Mesolithic is used quite differently in different parts of the world, in different parts of Europe. So in the north and in Russia, quite often Neolithic will really refer to the arrival of pottery, whereas obviously in the West, we're talking about the arrival of agriculture. We just have to. So production of surplus, increased sediments and territoriality, not with the arrival of pottery. So whilst these social and demographic attributes might have been the ceramic using hunter-gatherers, be attributed to the technology itself. This is Zamoshti, which I was just talking about, and here's the stratigraphy of the site. Fantastic site, very well preserved organic remains in this riverbed, and you can see we have final Mesolithic. That should be early Mesolithic, at around 7,000, going up to the late Mesolithic and final Mesolithic about 5,900, and then pottery appears around 5,200, and we have continuous middle Neolithic layers. So when we did the analysis layers, which are here in orange, and the middle Neolithic, the early Neolithic pottery, which are here in orange, which correspond to the Upper Volga culture, and the green, which corresponds to the middle Neolithic, the late level culture. So green and orange on this plot. And what we're seeing here is something very interesting. We're seeing in the orange these filled in diamonds, which is telling us in the pots. Also, the isotopic composition is looking a lot more like plant carbohydrate, and there's a switch when we move into the middle Neolithic where everything is focused again on fish, a bit like the Narva culture in the Eastern Baltic. So initially, same, this is for aquatic biomarkers. There are some, but very few. And when we move into the middle Neolithic layers, then it becomes completely aquatic. So initially, pottery had a much broader range of uses, and only latterly did it become very aquatic focused. So again, this shows that there is the model of this aquatic Neolithic doesn't really hold in this case. Again, this is sub-regional culinary practices in the Middle Don and Middle Volga. These are a range of sites in the Volga Basin and the Middle Don Basin. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but in the Middle Don, we have a lot of aquatic foods. We were able to identify there, whereas completely different use, much focused on wild ruminants, so deer, in the Volga Basin. And what's interesting about this is that the environments of these different sites are quite similar. There's hunter-gatherers living in very similar environments, but using their pots in very different ways. One focused on fish, one focused on other types of aquatic food. So there's these sub-regional culinary patterns that are appearing in hunter-gatherer pottery. It's much more complex than pots were being used just for one thing by hunter-gatherers. Now, this is the overall induced data set now. So this is the analysis of 1,242 hunter-gatherer vessels from northeastern Europe. And so it's a huge amount of work, and maybe 3-4 years of from all over the region. And we can see some very interesting data here. And overall, 50% of all the pots we analysed contained aquatic foods. And we found the aquatic biomarkers, which were indicating they had heated oils from aquatic foods, which most likely were freshwater fish, marine fish, could be some aquatic, some mollusks, and we can't rule out marine mammals either. Majority freshwater, because we were mainly looking at inland sites, but the coastal sites also had marine foods in. The other 50% had a different distribution and were mainly these kind of non-ruminants and wild ruminants. So one thing that came out of this was we were not finding the use of pots for things like tree resins or other forms of technology. It could, 99% could be attributed to culinary use for preparing foods and mixtures of different foods. So I think that's quite important because people had suggested that perhaps pottery was used for, I don't know, for making pine resin or for a range of other purposes. No, it seems to be totally focused on food preparation and cuisine. No evidence of beeswax, for example. So very little production of honey. Of course, some of the sites were too far north for the honeybee to really flourish, but some of the sites weren't. So it was about food. A quick aside, we also looked at a number of these oval bowls. So this data here is all cooking pots. When we look at the oval bowls, or these lamps, we see that they had a very different use to the cooking pots. This data here shows that at coastal sites, carbon isotope value was more marine, so it was more marine focused, and we found marine oils, fish oils, in a larger proportion of these vessels than the cooking pots from the same sites. Similarly, at inland sites, we find a greater proportion of freshwater fats in the lamps than in the cooking pots from the same site. And Estuarine Lagoon, it's a bit in the middle. And other things told us that the fats and the residues in the lamps were predominantly oil-based. So we can be really confident that these were used for something else, and we guess that they were used for illumination. And this comes from ethnographic analogies as well, where these kind of lamps, for example, in the Arctic, are used for burning fish oils. It could be seal oil, it could be fish oils, it could be freshwater fish oils. So we're pretty clear that these have got fairly homogeneous use across the study area, and these are found all the way around the Circumbaltic. If we look just now at the cooking pots, as the lamps aside, we can actually, this is a bit complicated, but we can see that actually the proportions of ruminant, aquatic, plant were varied by region. And we find in these, this is the evidence of these regional cuisines. Towards the Baltic, we see more marine, more aquatic. In other places, we see less, more ruminant products, but there seems to be some patterning according to the regions. So where does that leave us? Well, pottery had a wide variety of culinary uses in hunter-gatherer societies. It's not adopted in response to an economic need. Okay, so knowledge of pottery production did not necessarily predate the need for pots. There's no genetic evidence for population replacement, and this is from the limited number of DNA studies that have been carried out, showing that there was a change between aceramic and ceramic hunter-gatherers. There's a few data available. We don't see a big demographic change or diffusion of people during the mid-Holocene. So it seems that we need to use cultural evolution to explain the arrival of ceramic technology in this region. So to do that, we need reliable dates. And this has always been a problem because we had a large database of dates It's the database that Peter Jordan used to map the dispersal across Eurasia. But 90% of these, let's call them legacy dates, were measured by old radiometric decay counting, labs like Kiev. So using a very old, not AMS, using an old form of radiocarbon. Often the dates appeared to contradict each other. Sometimes the dates were made on just total pottery organic content. So they would just crush whole pot up and extract the carbon and put that into the radiocarbon facility. And the problem with that is you don't know what the source of the carbon is. It could be coming from, I don't know, geological carbon that's come from the pot matrix, from lots of different sources. A lot of dates were on food crusts, those carbonized deposits, which you might think, well, they're going to be related to the use of the pot. But these have, as we've shown, the potential for large freshwater marine reservoir effects. This is where old carbon that's been residing in rivers and the seas, that's incorporated into the fish and then cooked into pots, potentially making those dates too old as well. So we have, from what we saw from these old dates, perhaps pottery going from 7,000 to 4,000 calibrated BC, perhaps a wave of advance and perhaps demographic expansion. There was some old work done on that, but we really need to reevaluate. So we started a big new dating program, and we dated hundreds of new vessels. We used food crusts, we used terrestrial animal bone to try and avoid the freshwater and the marine reservoir effects. And sometimes we used other materials, sometimes things like plant chaff that's incorporated into the pots itself was quite useful. And what we see straight away is that if you start to take these different sites and you can compare the bone dates, so this is bone collagen of terrestrial animals, not fish obviously, terrestrial animals, so no reservoir effects, on collagen, AMS, and compare them with the older legacy top dates, you can see that quite often the top dates, these are total organic carbon dates, are too old and also very highly variable. And when you start to date the animal bone, you get a much shorter sequence. You get much more what we call the reliable sequence. And it's clear that these older dates, going back into the 8th millennium, were clearly, no, sorry, this is 6th millennium BP, were clearly, not right. So this is the case of, I'll throw this one for asset for Dobke, and we can see another problem here is the freshwater reservoir effect. We analysed quite complex residues from the Etibolo Pots from Dobke, and we found that in many cases there was plenty of freshwater lipids present, a large amount of freshwater lipids. And they plotted here. They also had aquatic biomarkers, so we're clear freshwater fish. And we know that already because there's so much freshwater fish at this site. Quite a lot of ruminant fats as well in some of the vessels, but also mixed in with freshwater fish as well. No dairy, which is encouraging, I guess. But also when we look at the SEM analysis, so scanning electron microscope analysis of the food crust, we were finding some of these plant foods as well. Similar, I didn't show it actually, I forgot to mention it, but similar to Zamoshti, we're finding particularly this verbenum species, which was present, this kind of flowering fruit that was available all over the study area. And so we've got quite a complex mixture here of freshwater resources, ruminant fats, so deer fat, plant material as well. So some will have a freshwater effect, some won't, and it gets quite complicated. One thing we can look at to try and look at the effect of freshwater fats is the nitrogen isotope values, because the nitrogen isotope values reflects how much, more or less, how much fish is present. And what we see is a clear correlation between the 14C age and the bulk nitrogen age on these food crusts. So the older ones have much higher nitrogen isotopes than the younger ones. So this suggests that the 14C age of the terrestrial ingredients is perhaps only 5,300 years ago. And that there's a freshwater reservoir effect of at least 600 years in this area, which would mean that the pointed base pottery may date as early as 4,200 calibrated BC. Now, I know that with more dates is needed from this site to kind of confirm that and to look at that in more detail. And as I say, this is work in progress. But it's interesting to show you what the effects of this reservoir effect can be. Here again, this is Sky 5, and you can see there's a clear difference. These are dates actually on food crust, and these are dates actually on animal bone. And you can see the animal bones are always younger than the food crust, and that's because there's freshwater fish incorporated into the food crust. And then it's not so clear, but this was an experiment that John Meadows did. He took 20 fish from one Estonian river that he caught recently and dated them. And some of the dates that the youngest, of course these are all modern, or fresh fish, but some of these fish were dating as old as 1,500 years ago. So modern fish with a 1,500-year reservoir, some much younger, 200 years. The point is it's really variable. So the freshwater reservoir effect is really hard to correct for because it's really variable across this region and regions as well. So to cut a long story short, if we disregard the food crust dates, where there's aquatic foods in, and we focus on the animal bones, we can then come up with a kind of spatio-temporal model for the dispersal, a least cost model for the dispersal of ceramics across the study area. And we can see that the youngest dates are still in the east, that's reassuring, but they're much later than previously thought. They're falling around 6,600, 6,500 at the very earliest in Western Siberia. In the Caucasus, maybe a bit later, 6,200, 6,300. And then coming all the way to the Baltic, and we have evidence, for example, in the Eastern Baltic of pottery around 5,400, 5,500. So that's a very long way in very few years, telling us that dispersal is happening at an average rate of 6 to 10 kilometers a year. Of course, it's not like that. It could be more punctuated and slow, but that's the average dispersal dynamics. Now, why that's interesting is because it's far faster than the dispersal of farming, which has been studied using similar approaches, which is usually seen as around 1 kilometer a year. So 6 times faster ceramics moving through this region amongst hunter-gatherers than farming dispersing through Europe and carrying pottery with it. We can try and then put more information into this model by looking at the production traits, looking at technology, how the pots were put together, how they were manufactured. And if we do that, we can see that actually there's regional, and this is doing a huge multivariate analysis of thousands of vessels that Katia Dolbanova and Henny Pazonka have gone and studied themselves. She came here, I think, and studied Dobke, and it's in this model as well. And she can, if you do that and do the multivariate analysis, you can see that there's clear clustering by decoration, by morphology, by technology. It's a little hard to see here, but you can see the blue ones are all in this region, are all clustering in terms of decoration, in terms of the morphology as well. And so we can see these different groups appearing in the way that hunter-gatherers are using pottery, clustering into different regions. Organic residue analysis cluster a little bit. It's not so as clear as decoration, morphology, and technology. But then we do something very clever, which is we try and correlate these different things together on a site-by-site basis, and also look at the dispersal dynamics through time. And what we can see there is that actually technology, morphology, decoration, and their use are all correlated. They're inherited together. So people are learning how to make pots from their neighbors. They're learning the technology and how to decorate them, but they're also acquiring the tradition of how to use them from their neighbors. These things are being inherently passed on together, reflecting deep-rooted social traditions, which is kind of structuring communal activities. So to sum up, conceivably, knowledge of pottery production spread very quickly through hunter-gatherers in northeastern Europe during the later half of the 7th millennium. And we can't explain this from demographic expansion. It was acquired through networks of interaction. So notions of how to construct and use pottery inherited together, perhaps through patrological kinship. We've looked at this and looked at some of the distances. Ethnographic examples attest to this. Perhaps through cooperative harvesting, where people are coming together at particular points of the year to learn how to make pots. And pottery is fairly easy technology to pick up. It can be learned quite quickly, and the raw materials are usually available. So it's different to some other technologies. So pottery was only adopted after the idea became acceptable through social interacting with neighbouring groups. That explains this dispersal process. And what's really interesting is pottery not accept. Why was pottery not seen in certain regions? Why is there no Mesolithic pottery in Britain? Why is there no Britain before agriculture? You know, we had all the conditions there for producing pottery. And we have nearby countries that are using pottery at this time, in the Netherlands, in Denmark. We don't have it in Britain at that time. We do have other forms of Mesolithic technology that are moved into Britain, but not pottery. And perhaps this was due to low population densities, and they just weren't comfortable with inheriting it. So that's where we're up to with this. I'll just finish by saying a few words about what the last kind of aim of what we're trying to do with the INDUCE project, and this is work really ongoing, which is how did potteries change for the introduction of farming. And of course, the hunter-gatherer world ends, farming comes in, we start to see new artifacts, we start to see the appearance of domesticates, and we really want to know what degree that impacted the economies of these people. There's a lot of work looking at the genetics to see how the people changed, but also how the cuisine changed as well. So for example, in the Western Baltic, we have this, Central and Western Baltic, I should say, we have this transition to the funnel beaker culture, which is associated with agriculture in many cases. In the Eastern Baltic, we have this transition to eventually the corded ware culture a little later, where we have the first evidence for agriculture as well. And pottery is really good at doing this, because I think what we're looking at, you know, you could say, well, why don't you just look at the faunal remains or the botanical remains? You can look at the impact. Pottery is telling us something else. It's about how food is perceived, how food is being used. And for so long, when people have written about this, they've seen food as a kind of prestige item. When agriculture was adopted, it was for prestige reasons, or it was something to do with the economy. It was just better for the economy. But really, I think this divorces it from social circumstances. And when people adopt things, that it's a series of evaluation processes in culminating in a whole different reasons. And it's always reference to social contact. So the point here is, by understanding how foods were used and valued in the past through pottery analysis or other forms of analysis, might allow us to understand why they were. At its heart is about why people decided to change the foods they were eating. It's a culinary change in many respects. So it's not all just about economy, it's related to other things as well. And now if we look overall, and this is a huge amount of data now, and it's not up to date this is, in terms of residue analysis, over almost 5,000 early agricultural sites have been analysed. Pottery, 5,000 pots from early agricultural sites. The orange dots here, all over Europe, down into Anatolia, all through all these orange dots here in Central Europe, through the Mediterranean, up the Atlantic coast, in Britain as well. And hunter-gatherer pots have been analysed, 3,000, we've done another 1,000 now. More or less the story's the same. In the early farming pots, we see no fish. Not what, I think there's one or two in the majority of cases in Britain. The majority in the southern, central, southeastern Europe, people have been really looking to see whether there's fish. There's a little bit now in the Angates Gorge, which has been a bit more recently, but very little identification of fish and aquatic resources. Hunter-gatherer pots, completely different. These larger circles indicates the correspondence of how much aquatic food's on, sometimes up to 100%. And the only difference is in the Baltic. When we move into the agricultural phase, they're still using the pots for processing aquatic foods, perhaps because there's a continuity in the ceramic tradition from pre-existing Mesolithic ceramic using hunter-gatherers. Finally, this is some work we did a long time ago in the Western Baltic project, where we were able to go to Denmark and northern Germany and analyze pottery from these different layers. Some fantastic shell middens where you have late Mesolithic occupation and immediately following early Neolithic occupation. And we can take pots from both those layers. Some fantastic submerged sites as well, with mix of Etibolo and funnel beaker pottery in this region. And this is a little summary. We've done a lot more now, but it explains it quite nicely. Here is the Etibolo Pots, okay? So you can see ruminant foods, so this would be deer, no milk, these are hunter-gatherers, Etibolo, Mesolithic, lots of marine foods in the pots, 44 sites analysed. Now we go and look at the Neolithic, early Neolithic funnel beakers. We can see lots of marine still, continuity in the use of pottery. They're still fishing, they're still using pots for fish, but suddenly this new product arrives, and that's dairy products. And so even at these coastal sites, these blue sites, we're seeing dairy products arriving in the early Neolithic. We're seeing this kind of fusion cuisine, this continuity going back from the Mesolithic and the arrival of this dairying in the early Neolithic. And what's more is that quite often we're finding the dairy foods in very specific forms of pots. So overall, this is my last slide. What do we think what's going on here? This is hypothesis, working hypothesis, is that the larger vessels seem to be used for staples, communal cooking, large-scale processing with marine foods, wild ruminants, starchy plants, and they don't really change their use. The vessels change completely, but the use remains very similar. Lamps seem to disappear when we go into the later stages of the funnel beaker, at least in the Western Baltic. We think they're used for illumination, so what happens? Does the need for illumination change in the farming communities? And then we have these dairy foods appearing perhaps in different forms of vessels, smaller vessels, reflecting more careful preparation. Do we find dairying in the Etibolo? There's a few cases that perhaps could be dairy foods, which presumably are contact with farming groups quite near. So this is where we're up to. We want to test a lot more pots across this transition to try and firm up this story furthermore. Okay, so that's me done. Thank you for listening, and really thanks to the Early Pottery Research Group, but also to the many collaborators who've really helped us along and made this possible.
Okay, thank you, Olivier, for this. Question and answer. That is the Africa. Why?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It is kind of two scenarios.
That's a really interesting question. And this is Kevin Gibbs and Peter Jordan suggested this African. They're looking at their dates, and they were suggesting that they're having early pottery technology, at least the technology, in hunter-gatherer communities, as I understand, this wavy line pottery of the Nile Valley that does seem to move north before we start to see vessels arriving in the Near East. And they suggested from that pottery technology might have been transmitted around that southeastern Mediterranean coast. I mean, it's not the area I work in directly, but from that region. Other people, I clearly see what you're saying, you know, from the Natufian and into the pottery Neolithic, you can see this continuity in the use of vessels. So I don't think we really know where pottery was acquired from in this region, whether it was innovated independently in these pottery Neolithic groups, or whether it was acquired from these hunter-gatherer groups further to the south and to the south.
So in this sense, I mean, the pottery in the Near East is not the element of the so-called Neolithic package, but rather something that is coming from elsewhere.
So there we're disentangling the technology, which is pottery, from its actual use. And this is, I think, one of the problems we've got is that from the Western point of view, we see farming and the technology of pottery so closely entwined because they're always inherited together. In the majority of sites as we go through Europe, we see the package arriving, and the dates are the same for the arrival of agriculture and the arrival of pottery are indistinguishable. And somehow we think they're inextricably linked. And so what is the reason for that thought? Because the majority of the rest of the world don't think that. You know, this is very much in our doctrine, taught from, you know, I was taught by archaeologists working there. And the only thing I can think is that they're inherited together just by happenstance. Is that the culture does move, and it has pottery technology, it also has farming, but there's no reason why agriculture can't exist without pottery, and pottery can't exist without agriculture. And clearly, in the Levant, we do have agriculture before pottery. There's no reason to think that you need to have agriculture and pottery. So I think what we need to do is divorce these things and see that when you're looking at transmission, perhaps they are inherited together, but they needn't not be. You know, there might be other explanations for this dispersal of these different elements of the Neolithic package. Yeah. Yeah. I'll try and go back to it. Yeah. I mean, this is absolutely fascinating because you can almost see it like the meeting of two worlds here. And so, you know, pottery producing people arriving at the Baltic coast, hunter-gatherer communities not that long before also arriving at the Baltic coast. I mean, what's the nature of that interaction? And from looking at the vessel use, one thing that we might be able to suggest, and we're still waiting for a lot of the DNA data to see whether there's a big population change at that point, but peaceful hunter-gatherer communities, which by themselves are sedentary, they're producing surpluses, they're very in the same mind as farmers, sedentary, producing surplus. The same things are going on. And you really want to know what's going on at that interaction. Mm-hmm.
We determine a specific kind of fish or a mammal based on lipids analysis?
Yeah,
pottery?
That's a great question. And the answer really is no, not easily. We can distinguish freshwater fish from marine, but if we're looking at fresh marine mammals or marine fish, we can only use the isotopes to really try and determine them, and they're quite isotopically similar in terms of the carbon isotopes. And so, depending on where they're from, you know, what kind of reservoirs or where they're living, we might be able to do something if we have a lot of bones to compare with, but it's really difficult to do that. And there is a way we can move on to, which we are trying to do, which is to look at the proteins present. So these are a different form of macromolecule that we do know preserve in certain cases, and that will give us a lot more information of the origin of the animals that were incorporated into the residue. So yes, the answer is potentially, but not using the lipid approach.
More like comment than a question. I'm just looking at this slide because on Africa, yeah, I mean there's a big question of the datings of beginnings of pottery in Africa, you know, but in north and northeastern Africa, and as it is shown on there's a lot of discussion, and about the very beginning of it, because there's a lot of publications, from the group I'm involved somehow on the areas pottery dating
Right.
levels, millennium even be. So, but then it's a question, really, because it's complicated. I will not go into details. So this picture, okay, wavy line pottery is also quite old. They all dated, but still, there is a problem how old it was. But then, yes, this red line. Yep. What is the reason of putting this red line on this way?
Yeah. So,
Because, okay, so there are two centers of pottery
Yes.
production, and they just met around the Baltic.
so as I'm not. This isn't my take. I'm commenting on it, but what they did was they did this least cost model. So they put these two origins in, one in Africa, one in East Asia, and then they let the model, flow and trying to pick the models that fitted to the dates most accurately. And this is the best fit they came up with. And in this model, below this quite unfortunate red line, really, isn't it? But this red line is the pottery that originated can be traced back, fixed with the dispersal from North East Africa, whereas above the red line it fits with the dispersal from the Far East.
Yeah, but at least when you look at the central and Baltic coast, southern Baltic coast.
Yeah.
Well, speaking about donkey, but
Yeah.
there's actually there's now about the relations between Neolithic pottery, real Neolithic
Yeah.
pottery, and that's what they were producing. And there's suggestions and okay, it went from these. So somehow was connected with Eastern Baltic.
Yeah.
So,
I would say that these dates are really speculative. They're based upon, they're just spot dates that are taken from a whole range of different contexts. And as I said,
okay, well, it doesn't matter,
if we look, what we had to do was to redate the majority of these sites because the dates were just unreliable. Those early dates in the East are unreliable. So if we go back and perhaps look at this date, this map, or focusing on this area, we can perhaps see a bit more of a different story emerge, and it's more hesitant, but I think that's more reflecting the actual nature of the data. And what needs to be done is more detailed dating, particularly in Western Siberia, particularly in Northeast Africa, because also the distribution of the dates is completely all over the place. There's whole areas where we have 1 or 2 AMS dates for thousands of kilometers. It's not the story cannot be told from that first map. It needs to be done on a much more systematic basis. The modelling needs to be improved, and the data needs to be improved.
okay.
So we're far away from knowing, I'd say.
Okay. I don't know if there's anything else. We have to probably come to an end. So thank you once again, Oliver, for this wonderful talk, and it will be posted on the webpage of the Academy of Sciences, and people can actually listen to this talk later on as well. Thank you, all of you, being here and listening to us. And as regards the next meeting of the Archaeological Commission, probably that's going to be very June, early informal detail. So thank you for being with us, and dziękuję do widzenia.
You're welcome.